Hello! Come along for an adventure through the Maxwelton Watershed system. Before we begin, let's get to know our map. This is a map of the small portion of the south end of Whidbey Island. The red border signifies the Maxwelton Watershed. The light blue lines represent the many bodies of water flowing throughout the south end. The dark green colors indicate wetland areas, and the gray lines show some major roads. Located in the middle of the Salish Sea, Whidbey Island connects the Strait of Georgia, the Juan de Fuca Strait, and the Puget Sound within the Puget Sound watershed. Water travels through Whidbey Island along 72 different watershed systems. These watershed systems are broken up by watershed boundaries. As water falls to the earth in the form of rain and snow, it first lands on the high points such as mountains and hills. Water flows down these high points to create streams, creeks, lakes, and rivers. Which way the water flows is determined by which side of the mountain or hill it runs off of, creating these different watershed boundaries. South Whidbey Elementary School is located within the Maxwelton watershed. This is the largest watershed on Whidbey Island, spanning 7,000 acres and almost 20 miles of stream waterways. This watershed is especially important for species such as chum salmon, coho salmon, and cutthroat trout that use these streams for passage. In this video, we will be exploring the Maxwelton watershed by stopping at key features of the watershed system, such as the headwaters, confluences, tributaries, and the mouth. Our first stop is at South Whidbey High School Farms, located at South Whidbey High School. This is the location of the Maxwelton watershed headwaters, the beginning source of the watershed. At first glance, you would never guess that this is the location of the headwaters, because there is no free-flowing visible stream that is present like there is at most headwaters. These headwaters here are all stored underground. When water enters a watershed, a portion of the water that does not travel to a tributary soaks into the ground in a process called infiltration. Large portions of groundwater collect in underground pools called aquifers. The water stored in aquifers are a vital source of drinking water for humans and irrigation for plant crops. The water that is stored here is called groundwater. Even groundwater is still pulled by gravity to travel down the watershed to the Maxwelton Creek. Our next stop is at Midvale Corners. This area has been used as farmland for over 100 years and is home to the surface breaching headwaters of the Maxwelton watershed. This is one of the first locations in the watershed where the groundwater reaches the surface to form the beginnings of Maxwelton Creek. Maxwelton Creek is the largest tributary of a watershed. And a tributary is a type of stream that flows into the larger bodies of water, like a lake, bay, or an ocean. This upper part of the Maxwelton Creek is a very important habitat for fish species of coho salmon and chum salmon. These types of fish hatch in upper areas of the watershed. Coho salmon will spend the next 2 years in this area before traveling downstream to the rest of the lower watershed. Chum salmon will travel down the watershed right after hatching. It is important that these small streams stay free of pollution and are filled with clean, cool water. In order to reach the ocean, the salmon fry need a healthy, connected watershed to live. Our next stop is Miller Lake, where the unique watercolor has earned the watershed some pretty cool nicknames. Maxwelton Creek flows down Midvale Corners, under Maxwelton Road, until it reaches the checkpoint of Miller Lake. Miller Lake acts as a reservoir, or holding place, for much of the water traveling down Maxwelton Creek. Surrounding Miller Lake are many layers of peat. Peat is formed from the compressions of decaying plant and moss materials. As these plants and mosses get squished and decomposed, a chemical called tannins is released. Tannins seep into Miller Lake and cause the water to turn a rust brown color. This process is completely healthy and natural for the watershed and turns all the water that flows from Miller Lake a deep rusty brown color. This color is a unique characteristic of the Maxwelton watershed and has led to the Maxwelton Creek receiving the nickname of the Pepsi-Cola Creek. Our next stop is Quade Creek, the second largest tributary in the Maxwelton watershed. The natural flow of Quade Creek has been drastically changed throughout the years due to the presence of several dams built by beavers. Sometimes these dams can be a nuisance to humans because beavers remove trees to build their dams, and then these dams change the pattern of how water flows throughout the watershed. These changes can sometimes lead to extra flooding or extra droughts. But when looking at the perspective of the whole watershed ecosystem, beavers play a very important role. Beavers help to clean the water that flows through their dam. The dam provides a habitat for many aquatic species and helps to reduce erosion of the stream banks. Here at Quade Creek, there is a great example of a confluence. A confluence is a location in a watershed where two bodies of water meet and combine to form one larger body of water. Quade Creek begins as a much smaller tributary and meets up with Kinski Creek to continue flowing down the watershed as a larger Quade Creek. Next stop is at the outdoor classroom, where we will be exploring what a healthy watershed looks like. Here at the outdoor classroom, we can really see those tannins present in the water through that rust-bound Pepsi Cola color. Here we can also see white foamy clouds floating on top of the water's surface. Although this could be easily mistaken for some sort of pollution, this foam is completely natural and an important part of the Maxwelton Creek ecosystem. This foam is created through decomposing plant and animal materials. As these materials decompose, they release a gas called dissolved organic carbon. This carbon forms tiny bubbles that join together to form large masses of foam. The foam helps aquatic plants grow and provides shade and shelter for many aquatic organisms in the stream. Our next stop is at the wetland areas off of Maxwelton Road. This area was once an estuary. An estuary is an area where fresh water and salt water mix. Estuaries are important habitats that hundreds of plants, aquatic animals, and land animals need to survive. Over 100 years ago, a dike, or a type of large wall, was constructed at Maxwelton Beach to prevent extreme flooding. This estuary was once 200 acres large, but due to the dike, it has significantly shrunk in size. Today, this area is almost completely a freshwater wetland, meaning it is missing the saltwater mix that is present in an estuary. Although freshwater wetland systems are also really important, the loss of a large estuary has had effects on the number of native plants and animals present here. Our final stop is at Maxwelton Beach. Maxwelton Beach is the mouth or drainage basin of the Maxwelton watershed. The mouth is the final part of the watershed, where all the water flows into the sea. The water that enters the Puget Sound here at this beach began as rainfall flowing down the watershed system from our first stopping point at South Whidbey High School. This area is very important for our fish species of coho and chum salmon that use this as a passageway into the sound. Also located at this beach are tide gates. These gates allow water to pass through when the tide goes one direction and stops the water when the tide changes direction. This is a tool to help prevent flooding and keep the land we live and farm on nice and dry. We can help keep our beautiful watershed nice and healthy by making sure there is no pollution like trash or litter in the water, by not using chemical fertilizers to grow our crops, and by planting many native plant communities along the water banks to provide important habitat spaces for native creatures. Thank you for joining in on this adventure and have fun exploring your local watershed for yourself.